Faculty of English, Adam Mickiewicz University, in another lecture in a series called IAS Invited Lecture Series on Challenges and Affordances of Qualitative Methodologies. This time, and I am very sorry on behalf of the Dean that unfortunately she cannot be with us, but due to very many other obligations. But as you know, this lecture may also be consulted following, because it is recorded as part of the series. Now, let me welcome today our very special guest, Professor Lisa el Refaie from Cardiff University. Because I always look for connections with Poznań and Poland, but specifically Poznań, I must tell you that Professor El Refaie is a part of the, let me check, Center for Language and Communication Research. So when I saw that name, I immediately associated with it with a colleague, our colleague from Poznań, who spent very many years and was educated in Poznań and introduced, was one of the people who introduced sociolinguistics to our linguistic studies, Professor Adam Jaworski. Now, back to our special guest, though. Professor El Refaie is a reader in visual communication at Cardiff University. And because there isn't that much time for a lengthy introduction today, I do refer you to so much information that is on the website about our guest. I would just like to mention two books authored by our guest today. Autobiographical comics, Life Writing in Pictures, published in 2012, but very importantly for our interests, also another book called Visual Metaphor and Embodiment in Graphic Illness Narratives. This I am singling out, and this was published in 2019, so pretty recently. I am singling it out because we have a special program on related to communication in healthcare. And we only began this a couple of months ago, so I'm sure we will find many connections. Before I give the floor to our speaker today, I would like to tell you that there is a question session planned for the latter part of this meeting. However, we will be closing this lecture at 1. So, and I know there are students especially interested in asking questions. I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry. Please ask your questions on the chat, right? Professor El Refaie will be able to address these questions later on, perhaps, and has agreed to be in touch with you if you have very specific questions to ask her, referring to things other than the lecture. So, once again, we are very happy to host Professor El Refaie here, and the floor is yours, or the screen is yours.
Well, thank you so much for this very kind introduction, and it's lovely to be talking to you all. Especially about a topic that is very close to my heart. So I'm really fascinated by metaphor. I've been studying it for many, many years, and in particular visual metaphors and multimodal metaphors. So I hope to be able to share some of this enthusiasm with you today, and maybe inspire some of you to study this fascinating topic as well. So I will share my PowerPoint with you. Hope you can all see that all right. Good. I've entitled I've actually used the metaphor as the title of my presentation. So how to dissect visual metaphors while keeping them alive. I would like to start, I will explain what the metaphor is all about, what this metaphor is all about, but I'd like to start by showing you an example actually of some data I'm currently analyzing. And I just thought I'd give you maybe a minute just to take a look at this image and to maybe note down or to just think of what this means to you, or what meanings this conveys to you. So I just give you a couple of minutes to take a look at this. Right, so the original image actually contains some writing as well. I might read it out for you because it might not be so easy for you to read. So the text at the top says, what once was light, bright and beautiful now hides in the dark, cracked, damaged. And then it says broken, trapped. And then there's a further down, it says can't breathe. Yeah, so it might already give you the sense that this person, the artist, was not talking about a broken vase, but that they were talking about something else. Yeah, so that there's some kind of metaphor involved here, and the fact that the artist is referring to not being able to breathe might also give you the sense that it's about some kind of living. It's being compared to some kind of living creature or object, living being. So it's not an inanimate thing that they're talking about. And this is what the artist actually said about this drawing just after she'd created it. She says, I am a broken vase, yeah. What was light, bright and beautiful now hides in dark, cracked, damaged and broken, because that is how I feel, quite frankly. So the hole in the middle is it's what I feel has been taken away from me, and the cracks are the damage that's been done by the comments from the medical profession. So again, we have another layer of context here, and we can get a sense that it is about somebody struggling with some form of ill health, with some medical condition, and that she's commenting on how she feels about that, but also how she feels about the inadequate medical care she has received. And just to add another layer of context, it was actually this piece of data was produced in a drawing workshop that myself and some colleagues conducted with a group of endometriosis patients. So specifically, this person is talking about her experience of endometriosis, and then perhaps. If you think again of the vase and the way it was drawn, you might then also be able to recognize that the shape of the vase resembles perhaps the shape of a woman's body, and that there is a piece missing in the middle, which kind of corresponds to the belly or the abdomen, and in the context of this drawing workshop, where a lot of the women were talking about the loss they had experienced in terms of not being able to have children, because endometriosis sometimes can cause infertility. So that's adding additional meanings on top of that. You might also then recognize, if you know about endometriosis, the yellow color that is used in the drawing, both for the string around the sort of the neck of the vase and some of the cracks. Yellow color, that's the color of endometriosis awareness. So that's the color they use also for it's a symbolic meaning then that you have to learn, that otherwise you wouldn't know about. So basically, so I think the interesting thing about metaphors, as Professor McGilchrist says, he's a psychiatrist and philosopher who's written about really about the brain and how the human mind works. And he's very interested in metaphors because he says that metaphors may open up meanings that are extralingual, unconscious, and therefore potentially new and alive. So there can be all these meanings, all these connotations, all these layers of understanding that, as he then says, when you're using literal descriptions, these sometimes threaten to destroy the fruitful ambiguity of human experience by forcing it into explicitness. So if this patient had to explain, how frustrated she is with the medical profession and how sad she feels about, not being able to have children and so on, she would have had to express this in a more explicit way, perhaps, and or using verbal metaphors. Of course, that would be another option. And so, from the point of view of the analyst, I think the important thing to remember is that when we are analyzing metaphors, we must be careful not to destroy the very phenomenon we are wishing to explore. So, because metaphors have this sort of extralingual, unconscious quality that makes them alive, if we dissect them, if we take them apart, if we try to explain them literally what they mean, we can sometimes run the danger of destroying them in the process. It's a little bit like people who study humor as well, which I think they have the same problem, that if they try to explain why a joke is funny, it loses its the humor is lost in a way, or can be lost. So I like to use a metaphor of studying butterflies. So and specifically, this is a butterfly that a large blue butterfly, which was which is one of the most the rarest and most coveted butterfly in the British Isles, and people, there were so many people catching it and killing it and pinning it, categorizing it, and so on, that it was actually brought to distinction in the 1970s, and it's now being reintroduced. But people, it's prohibited to actually catch them and kill them now. So sometimes I think we might have to catch the butterfly and to study it, but ideally we would like to do so without killing it off in the process and setting it free again. And so the equivalence when we're studying metaphors is, I think, that we have to first of all look at metaphors always in their context. So we always need to take the context into account, and then we can analyze it in more detail, but then at the end try and reintegrate it into its original context. So in a way, setting it free again rather than killing it off in the process. So that's why I use this metaphor of the butterfly, which I hope will be meaningful to you in a way. So this is how I'm also going to try and structure my talk today. So I'd like to talk first of all a bit more about, well, what is a metaphor? What is a visual metaphor? But in particular, how does a metaphor always relate to context? And then I will talk a little bit about the formal features of visual metaphors. So how can we analyze visual metaphors in detail and look at their form and what the different formal features might mean. And then I'll use a case study, one or two, depending on how much time I have left, to show how you can then reintegrate an individual metaphor into the larger context again. And I'll be using examples from drawings about endometriosis, but also some from autobiographical comics, because that is another thing I like to study. So I'm not sure how much people know about metaphor theory, but people studying visual or multimodal metaphors are generally very much inspired by conceptual metaphor theory, which was founded by Lakoff and Johnson in early 1980s. And in particular, this book, which was it's a very kind of popularized form of academic writing, but I think they convey their main ideas very clearly. And one of their main arguments is that the essence of metaphor is understanding and experiencing one kind of thing in terms of another. So in other words, metaphor is not just a fancy way of speaking or writing, but it is conceptual. So it's about how we think. And this has the important consequence that you can express metaphorical thoughts in any mode or medium. So it's not just language, you can express it visually or through sounds or music and other media as well. The other main idea underpinning conceptual metaphor theory is that it's this idea that metaphors are based on our embodied experience. So basically, we as human beings, we can only access the world, we can only perceive the world, experience the world through our bodies. And we use that experience, that embodied experience, and project it onto things that are less concrete and less embodied. And they talk about source domains and target domains. So the source domain is, those are things that are more concrete, that we experience through our perceptions, through having a body, through being in the world. And the target domain are these more abstract experiences and areas, domains of conceptual understanding, such as social relations or emotions, that we then we need metaphor in order to understand them and talk about them in more detail. So some of the examples that they give is how, for instance, from when we're very little onwards, we experience a relationship or correlation between being able to see something and knowing that it's there, and knowing about it and understanding it, and that this is universal. There's a universal tendency then to talk about more abstract knowing and understanding, also in terms of vision. So we say things like, I see what you mean, or his motivations are transparent or obscure, our vision for the company is clear, and so on. The conceptual metaphor, so the underlying thought pattern, the pattern of correlation, they talk about mappings as well, is the conceptual metaphor, and that is expressed usually in small capital letters, starting with the source, with the target domain, with the thing we're trying to understand or talk about, in this case knowing and understanding, and then introducing seeing, the more concrete source domain, second. Whereas these then are the metaphorical expressions that we habitually, often without thinking, without even realizing that they're metaphorical necessarily, that we then use because we think like that. Yeah. So and another example of that is the fact that because we experience having a body that is affected by gravity, and having to, when we're moving about, when we're walking, when we're running and so on, having to resist gravity, that again, there is this universal tendency to associate positive things, health, happiness, power, ability, and so on, with up, and sadness and poor health and unhappiness and so on, lack of power with down. So, and then we get expressions like, I'm feeling so down today, or his words have lifted me up. Many people suffer from low mood and so on. Yeah. And perhaps the most famous example that Lakoff and Johnson gave is that we tend to conceptualize, well, life in general and our relationships in particular as journeys. Yeah. So again, it's very, very common to talk about being at a crossroads or having to go our separate ways. Our relationship is off the tracks, our marriage is on the rocks, and so on. Yeah. And similarly, people who are experiencing illness very often talk about their illness and their recovery in terms of a journey. So that's just a very common way of not just of talking about illness, but of thinking about it as well. So just another couple of points about conceptual metaphor theory. So one of the other important points that Lakoff and Turner make in another book is this idea that even when we think about the sorts of metaphors that literary theorists would have traditionally studied, or still might focus on, so the most creative, unusual, novel metaphors in literature and art, for example, or poetry, that even they tend to be based on the same correlations in experience as the sorts of conceptual metaphors I've just introduced to you, but they are typically more creative. Yeah. So what do they mean by creativity? Well, there are different forms of different ways of being creative. One is at the conceptual level, so at the level of thinking, so it's possible, for example, to extend, elaborate, or combine conventional correlation metaphors. So if we think again of the vase, for instance, it's quite common to think about and to express physical or mental ill health as something being broken. Yeah, so that's quite conventional. But here it is elaborated as a vase, so it's specific. It's not just anything that is broken, but it is specifically a vase that's broken, and it's also being extended in the sense that it's that she's expressing it, or she's representing it as a vase that is cracked, and also a vase that is hidden. Yeah, so we've got this second layer of meaning, this idea of the vase being covered by this in the shadows in a way, and hidden away. And then it's also combined with the metaphor of not being able to breathe. Yeah, so the shape of the vase is then mapped onto the human body, and then you have this idea of a string around the neck of the vase, which represents not being able to breathe, being suffocated as well. So in this sense, it is based on conventional ideas, but it is very much a creative elaboration and extension of it. Some metaphors that are sometimes referred to as image metaphors, resemblance metaphors, which tend to be more one-off. So they are really where one thing is compared to another thing, and there is no conventional correlation in experience, or no obvious conventional correlation in experience that it is based on. And then you can also, of course, have creativity at the expression level. So these are the sort of unique verbal or non-verbal representations of conventional ways of thinking. And you know, in a way, as soon as you are representing something visually, you are always introducing a certain level of creativity and uniqueness, because you can't just, for example, you can't just represent being broken. It has to be something specific that is broken. And then, of course, the way you represent that, you know, what the actual form is of that breakage, of that damage, that will also then be very concrete. So you're forced to be quite specific when you're drawing things. And also, of course, visual communication isn't conventionalized in the same way as language is. Yeah? So if you say, I feel completely destroyed, or I feel broken, that is quite a conventional way of expressing yourself. But as soon as you have to then represent that visually, you are having to choose images that are more specific to your own experience, so that are not as conventionalized in that sense. Right, then Zoltan Kovacs says his main point in this, and he's written a whole book about the importance of context. So this idea that metaphor production and understanding is always shaped by contextual factors. Yeah, so the specific situation that people are in, and the experience of their bodies in that context, also the broader sort of cultural context as well. So in the book that was mentioned earlier, that I wrote in 2019, I define visual metaphor in this way. So I defined it as any aspect of visual representation that invites us to consider one kind of thing, concept, or experience in terms of another. And since I've written that book, I've become more interested, or perhaps more aware of the importance of context. And so I think I would like to slightly amend this definition and add in context, yeah, because I just think that is so important. For if you think of the vase, perhaps when you looked at the drawing initially, it wasn't a metaphor at all. Yeah, so it might have been just the depiction of a broken vase. Then when the verbal text was added, you might have realized that it was a metaphor, but it wasn't perhaps very clear what that metaphor was all about. And as I added more contextual information, then the full meaning of that metaphor emerged. So I think we could talk about, this is something I'm actually still thinking about, how to kind of label these different layers of context. But I think a very basic distinction might be between co-text, so that's the text that appears in the image or directly with the image, and then the communicative context, which consists of contiguous and non-contiguous communicative context, and then the broader discourse context. So if we look at that in a bit more detail, so co-text is the written text forming part of an image, such as labels, speech or thought balloons, or text as part of a represented scene. So perhaps if you're drawing a scene with a road sign, for example, that might be part of co-text. And then the communicative context. So these are all the verbal or non-verbal representations within the same communicative event or narrative. So sometimes it might be within one story, or it might be within the communicative event. In this case, in the case I was just talking about, the workshop, the drawing workshop, for example, and there you have a contiguous context, so the immediate vicinity of the image. So this is the commentary, for example, of the artist or of other people talking about this image, but also perhaps in a graphic novel, for example, or in a comic, it might be titles or captions or narrative, the narrative sequence within which you have a particular metaphor. And then non-contiguous, this might be, recurring discussion items such as infertility, in the example I've just given, or narrative themes in autobiographical comics. And then the broader discourse context, this would include things like, cultural values, generic expectations, and intertextual reference to other similar or relevant texts. So to give you another example and show how context would sort of work in this example. So if you have, for example, this drawing of a face with two halves, without any context, it could just represent, perhaps two different states of mind, two different emotions occurring in one person, perhaps. But with the co-text, when you add the co-text, it becomes clear that this is about a mask. It's not two faces, but it's about wearing a mask. And that one half is about what you present to the world, what everyone sees, and the other half is about the reality and how this person actually feels. Again, we have the contiguous communicative context, where the artist is saying, you look perfectly normal, nobody can see your scars, they're hidden away, nobody can see your pain, and you wear a mask all of the time, you tell people that you're fine and everybody thinks that you're, but really that's how I really see myself. Yeah. So again, it's emphasizing this idea that it's about, you know, feeling unwell, feeling scars, literal, these might be literal scars, but also emotional scars, and feeling that you have to present something else to the world. And then the non-contiguous communicative context was the drawing workshop, which was part of a type of drawing workshop that some colleagues and I developed, and they're basically very structured drawing exercises for people who have no artistic background necessarily at all, and you start with very, very simple drawing exercises, and you build them up, and so at the end you encourage people to draw their experiences using visual metaphor, and they're particularly, these kinds of workshops seem to be particularly useful with taboo or sensitive topics. So we use them particularly in relation to sensitive health conditions. And in this particular workshop, as I mentioned before, this was with four women with endometriosis, and the main themes that were discussed were pain, physical pain, but also emotional pain, poor healthcare, sense of loss, in particular in relation to infertility, a sense of invisibility, and ways of coping. Yeah, so you can already see from, I think, from the two examples I showed you that some of those themes were picked up then in the individual drawings and elaborated in some way. And then the broader discourse context. So endometriosis is a very common condition. There are estimates that it affects approximately one in 10 women of childbearing age, and it results from endometrial tissue outside of the uterus, and it can cause a range of symptoms, and these can be quite hard to diagnose. So I think in the UK, it takes on average 7.5 years for a woman to receive a firm diagnosis, which, you know, is quite shocking, I think, and the women often really have a hard time before they can convince somebody that there's something really serious going on, and it's not just, you know, normal menstrual pain. Yeah, so and I think one of the difficulties is that pain is very hard to communicate, yeah, in general. So people often use metaphors to communicate pain, but sometimes I think doctors find that kind of language a little bit hard to understand and to translate into, you know, a medical diagnosis. And yeah, so it's partly a problem of communication as well, I think. So they're often disbelieved and dismissed by health professionals. So again, if you know about that context, then the kind of data I've just been showing you, I think then you can analyze all these different layers and levels of meaning much better than if you didn't have that context. Okay, so if we now get to the level of the individual metaphors and the forms they can take, and how these different forms can express various meanings. And for this, I would like to start with an example from one of the autobiographical comics I've been analyzing. I would like you to just take a couple of minutes. I can have a drink while I'm giving you time to take a look at this, and to see how many visual metaphors you think you can identify in this image. Okay, I'd like to start by explaining a little bit of the context. So the book is it's by Dunlap Scholl, the author is called. It's called My Degeneration, and he's suffering from Parkinson's disease, and this is shortly after he's been diagnosed. He's a cartoonist. He works for a newspaper in America, and he's getting really worried whether he'll be able to continue with his profession or not, because every time he picks up a pen and he's drawing, he experiences really severe pain in his arm and shoulder, and so he's just getting more and more worried about this. Okay, so that's the context. I just give you a minute to take a look. I hope you can read it. Can you read it? Is it yeah, visible enough? Good. Yeah, so I would imagine that you have all kind of identified the demon with the pitchfork on his shoulder. Yeah, that's the most obvious what metaphor scholars would call a pictorial metaphor. Yeah, so it's a picture of something concrete that stands for something else. And how do we know it's a metaphor? Well, because this comic is not it's not a fantasy world that we're being presented with here, but otherwise it's a very, very realistic story. Yeah, it's his own story of his life, and we know that demons don't exist in real life, so it must be a metaphor. Yeah, so but I don't know if you also noticed that for example the pitchfork and the pen that he's holding, that they are presented in some way as being similar. Yeah, so they are similar size, they are presented at a similar height and a similar angle, and they also have similar parts. So they've got a sort of handle bit, and they've got a sharp bit at the end, in the context of, well, at one level, he's equating the pain he's experiencing in his shoulder with the pain that putting pen to paper actually is causing him. But at another level, in the context of the whole story, where he talks quite a lot about how, as a cartoonist, he's also causing pain, causing damage to people's reputation and sometimes to their feelings. Yeah, he's quite a cynical, he starts off as quite a cynical person. So I think there's also this idea of an equivalence of pain being caused by the pitchfork or by his pen. And then we also have the fact that he is wearing, I don't know if anybody noticed, but he's wearing these glasses and you can't see his eyes. And that is something that I will talk about at the end of the session a bit more, but that is used throughout the book. It's a theme really about vision and how that relates to understanding and knowing and attitudes. So I will talk about that a little bit later. We also have, though, apart from the sort of pictorial metaphors where something specific, concrete is being depicted, we also have what I would refer to as spatial metaphors. So in particular here we have left and right are used in particular ways to represent something something more abstract. So we have the demon is sitting on his left shoulder, yeah, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail, but left and right have, because of handedness, yeah, we associate particular meanings with left and right, both individually and culturally, but I will mention that, I will talk a bit more about that in a moment. Also, he is turned to the left, and again, we associate, because of our writing direction, we tend to associate past and future with left and right. Again, I'll talk about that in more detail in a minute. And then apart from that, we also have aspects of the way things are represented, so the style, that might also be described as having metaphorical meaning. So in particular, if you look at the speech balloon where it says ow at the end, so the speech balloon itself has these very sharp edges, and the word ow is written in a very angular writing, and it's got these sort of scribbles underlying it. We could say that through synesthetic metaphor, aspects of so visual features are being used to evoke a sense of the pain experience. Yeah, so the idea, because so by means of associations with the damage that sharp shapes might cause, or the embodied experience of scribbling onto paper, that we can then use those associations and project that onto the experience of pain. So right, so basically we have then these three layers of metaphor: pictorial, which is where metaphorical meanings emerge from specific ways of depicting one or more concrete entities. Yeah, so the demon, or the pitchfork and the pen, or the eyes that are hidden by the glasses. And then spatial, which is where metaphorical meanings emerge from the spatial arrangement of both verbal and visual elements. And this is based on the experience of our bodies in space. Yeah, so for example, the up-down relationship that I talked about earlier as well. But then also what I've called stylistic metaphor, where you have metaphorical meanings that can emerge from the style in which pictures, words are presented, and or the materiality of the book itself. Yeah. So if we start then with pictorial metaphors, so pictorial metaphors have been studied for quite a long time now, and you might have heard of Charles Forceville, who's one of the pioneers in this area. And so I've adopted some of his terms, some of his concepts. I've added a few more, I've adapted it, some of them a little bit. But one of the forms that pictorial metaphor can take, which Charles talks about as well, is hybrid, where you basically take two things and you merge them together to create an impossible new form. So this is an example again from an autobiographical comic, where the little boy is being forced to sleep in a cubbyhole under the stairs as a punishment for fighting with his brother, and the father is opening this camping bed, this guest bed, and the bed has taken on features of a monster, because this little boy is so frightened of having to sleep in this cubbyhole. And then contextual metaphors, that's the example we've just seen of the demon with the pitchfork. It's where concrete entities are represented in a context where they are not expected, where they are in some way incongruous. Yeah, this example here is another example where an epileptic fit is represented through a kind of dragon that's wrapping itself around the body of this person suffering from this. And then another form is pictorial simile, which is where you have two or more entities that are depicted in a way that highlights their similarity. Yeah, so we saw the example of the pitchfork and the pen, but this is another one here where you have the autobiographical protagonist who again suffers from spina bifida, and here he's just been rejected by a girlfriend or by somebody, a woman he likes, and he's standing in the rain, and there's a scarecrow opposite, and he's obviously depicted the two in a way that makes us understand that he is comparing himself to this scarecrow. Then I also came up, I discovered another type of metaphor in the books I was looking at, which I've called body modification, which is where the human body is ostentatiously changed in some way. So this might be with glasses where the eyes are not visible, or in this case, so this also contains, this is a book about depression. Also, he also depicts himself with these glasses where you would expect the eyes to be, but there's also he's also drawn himself with a hole where you in his chest, basically, to show this feeling of well, the depression, basically. And then the final example, there are a few other categories, but just the final one I wanted to mention is typopictorial, which is where you're actually using text in some form, either individual letters, words, or text blocks, are made to look like a concrete thing of some kind, and that in turn then evokes metaphorical meaning. So here, this is mum's cancer. The mother's just been diagnosed with cancer. The doctors are talking to her, but she's really not understanding what they're saying, and she feels as if she's drowning in this terminology, basically. Yeah, so then briefly, spatial metaphor. So spatial metaphor is where the experience of our bodies in space is projected onto or is used for more abstract meanings. And in comics, for example, this can apply both to the pictures and to the text. So, as I mentioned before, up tends to be associated with good things, down with their opposites. This particular example is a book about depression. And here we have a very, very strong sense of downward motion. Yeah, so she's drawn lying down on a bed. We see her from above. The bed is also right in the bottom corner of the page. So to the extent that she's even cut off, we can't see the whole figure. And then we have these text blocks that are also going down. So we have to, with our eyes, we follow the text down to the figure at the bottom in order to read the text. Then we also have inside-outside spatial metaphors. So this is based on our experience of our bodies as a kind of container with an inside and an outside. You might have also noticed in the example I showed you at the beginning, where of the Parkinson's disease, where some of the elements were actually projecting outside of the panel borders, giving the sense of the pain being so uncontainable, so overwhelming that it cannot be contained within a panel. So panels in comics are often seen as sort of containers as well, or can be used in that way. And here we have perhaps a more pictorial representation of this idea. Somebody with an eating disorder who is representing, you know, her body as she experiences it, as being overly obese, and then her real self being inside that body and trying to get out and being much smaller. And her voice, "Please help get me out of here," is also inside her body. And then the narrative commentary, "I felt huge," is in a separate text box, so that feels a little bit distanced from her experience. And then at the bottom she has a more kind of general commentary on eating disorders and so on, and that is right at the bottom. It's also written in printed writing and so on. Yeah, so and that is even more separate, perhaps, from her own experience. Okay, and then finally, just to give another example, is left and right. So that there've been a lot of empirical studies that have shown that because that we tend to prefer things presented to us on the side of our dominant hand. Yeah, so if we're asked to make value judgments, we subconsciously project more positive values onto things on the dominant side. So if we're right-handed on our right side, or if we're left-handed on our left side, but of course, because 95% of the population are right-handed across all known cultures, there is this cultural preference for the right side as well. Yeah, so if we look at traditions in painting or also in language, languages universally, things on the right are seen as godly and good and male and powerful and so on, whereas things on the left are associated with the sinful, the worldly, the feminine, and so on. And then there's also this association between the past and the future. So and that seems to depend on writing direction in a culture. So if we write from left to right, as we do in the West, then people associate subconsciously the past with the left and the right with the future. This is an example of a book from Marbers about bipolar disorder, and she's writing about, you know, how the pros and cons of being bipolar. Yeah, and she's represented that using the left hand and the right hand. The left hand is also going down, the right hand is going up, and the left hand is black, the right hand is white, the left hand is drawn, you know, almost like a claw, and the right hand is much more rounded, and so on. Yeah, so that's also how left and right can be used. And this is from the same book, where she's representing how being manic can actually feel, although it's kind of going up, it can feel as if it's too much, and as if she's losing her grounding, or becoming detached from the rest of the world. So this is the original. So she's being pulled. This is kind of the future. She can feel that she's getting more and more manic. If it was flipped around, it would really change its meaning. Yeah, so we do have this association with the past and the future. So that would almost be that she's being dragged back, perhaps by her past experience or something. Yeah, and then finally, stylistic metaphor, where visual attributes such as shape, color, brightness, quality of line, or texture may suggest either non-visual sense perceptions or abstract meanings. So we've already seen an example of where the way the word owl was written, that might suggest a non-visual sense perception, so pain in this case. This is another book about an eating disorder, where again she's used this squibbly line to represent her emotional distress. So that kind of takes on, sometimes it's just a tiny cloud over her head, and sometimes it really envelops her whole body and so on. And again, because we know what it feels like to really scribble on a page, that gives us then this sense of what the associated emotions might be. She's also used different colors for the pages, so the more distressing the story gets, the darker the pages get as well. And it ends on a more positive note, and then the pages are paler gray. Yeah, so again, perhaps I'd like to just give you a minute or two to take a look at this example and see whether you could apply some of these ideas to this example. So whether you can find a pictorial metaphor, one or more, whether there's some spatial aspects that might be metaphorically, whether there's some stylistic elements you might discover. Yes, I just give you a couple of minutes and I have a quick drink, And then I will just, then just talk briefly about recontextualizing some of these examples. Yeah. Okay, so I would imagine that the hourglass, that is a very obvious pictorial metaphor. You know, it is a metaphor because it's, you know, normally with an hourglass you would just measure minutes, but here it's obviously about time more generally. And it's a giant hourglass, so it's in context, it's not a realistic object, it's a metaphor. Then you also have the type of pictorial metaphor where the word, so one way I had to decide, I had to decide whether to be a mother or not, and the word one way or another, the word another is actually trickling down and becoming part of the image and part of the sand trickling down. And then the spatial aspect, so you have, of course, you have the shapes. So you have the pregnant belly on the one side that sort of fits into the negative space of the hourglass, and in the same place where the baby is on the right hand side, you have the paint palette on the left. So that's kind of giving this idea of the baby and the painting being equivalent or being options for her to choose from. Then of course you've got again the aspect of left and right, so that might here represent past, well, the present and the future, perhaps the present her as an artist and the future possibly her as a mother. But it also has this aspect of, you know, as I say, of left and right also having value judgments attached to it very often, the right perhaps being generally considered the one with the higher value. And then we have also the black and white background, so that gives it a sort of yin and yang feel, but generally you know, black and white, because of our associations with light and darkness, tend to have, you know, darkness tends to have more negative associations than the white. So I think here the two play together to give this sense really of it being quite balanced at this stage, yeah, where she feels that both are equally valid options in a way. Okay, so then just for the final couple of minutes, I'd like to give you one example of how you might then sort of reintegrate some of these individual visual metaphors into their original context, and that how they would then get some extra meanings perhaps. So I'd like to use this Peter Dunlap Showell's My Degeneration as an example. So the general sort of narrative context is that throughout the book there is this theme where he correlates the ability to see things clearly, or rather, this is the more general discourse context. So as I mentioned in the beginning, we tend to correlate the ability to see things clearly with knowing or understanding things. Yeah, and that's a very universal conceptual metaphor. And particularly since the 17th century in our society, vision has assumed this really this top place in the hierarchy of the senses. So we tend to really value vision above all other senses, and it's become very closely associated with the male, rational, scientific worldview. And in medicine, of course, there's this idea of the medical gaze being more important than other senses in diagnosis and treatment, for example. But in fact, our seeing is complex and unreliable. So we miss as much as well, seeing is associated with blindness. Yeah, we're always missing things and seeing what is in our interest to see and what makes sense to us in a way. And so throughout this book, there's different ways of seeing are linked metaphorically to different ways of understanding the world. So in a way, he's questioning this dominant metaphor that seeing clearly always means knowing and understanding, and he's challenging that in some way, or playing with that idea. So it starts where he's talking about where he first starts to experience some symptoms of Parkinson's, and he says, so even before you know you have Parkinson's disease, it changes the way you perceive things and the way you are perceived. So the disease and the meds can first subtly and then profoundly alter your ability to make sense of a distorted and porous reality. So he's already using then a metaphor of the light being refracted here through a lens that sort of changes his perceptions. Yeah, and you might notice here that although he's wearing glasses, his eye is visible. Yeah, and we see the light falling into the eye and then being refracted and changing the vision. And this is both literal, so in a way his perceptions are really changing, particularly his perception of smell, but it's also metaphorically, yeah, in the way that it changes the way he sees the world in a more metaphorical way as well. Yeah, so as I mentioned, so throughout the book, he depicts himself with these glasses that obscure his eyes, and that's not just the convention he uses for all depictions of people, because his son and his wife wear glasses as well, but there you can always see their eyes. Yeah, so he's done that very deliberately. And then there's a whole sequence where he is shown a sort of extended metaphor where it starts with Peter in a paper boat, and it's made up of the newspaper articles, because he works as a newspaper cartoonist. And it says, I didn't realize that a hazard of editorial cartooning was misanthropy. Who would have guessed a run-in with a catastrophic disease would restore a more nuanced view of humanity? So he's verbally introducing this idea of a visual metaphor, but he's saying that the disease has actually made him see more clearly in some ways. So then his boat is capsized and he's thrown into the water, and we then have this panel where he's sinking to the bottom of the sea, and the words again are written, you know, in a way that the eye follows down. So there's a clear spatial metaphor here: angry, anxious, frustrated. And then he's washed up on an island, and we can see here he has lost his glasses. Yeah, so in theory he can't see as well anymore. He's cast up on the shore of the island of the caring and competent, he calls it. So by which he then means all the medical professionals, the scientists, and other patients involved. And then the following page, he says, the island is a weird country to a budding misanthrope. I don't get it. The islanders seem to be working to make a better present and future, and even succeeding to a surprising degree. It's a stark contrast. It's a stark contrast to the world of of hypocrites, cynics, and loudmouths that I satirized for so long. Yeah, so he's actually cleaning his glasses, then putting them back on as a metaphor for the fact that he can actually, without his glasses, paradoxically, he can actually see more clearly. So when he's ill, he can empathize more, and so in a way, he's changed his view of the world, but it's become more positive. I had another example, but I think I'll end here so we have a bit of time for questions. Yeah, thank you. Anyway, it's a bit strange because I can't actually see you. I'll stop sharing now so I can see more of you again. And if any of you would be happy to put your videos on, I think that would be really nice. But it would be nice to